Before I begin, all I'm going to say is y'all are very lucky Cornwall extended the deadline. So here's Weiwei, also known as sunflower seeds. It was made by Weiwei in 2010 and 2011 from sculpted and painted porcelain. So China had a dictator named Mao Zedong, and he was a dude who believed in communism. He led peasants in the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. In a failed attempt, he tried to quickly industrialize China in the Great Leap Forward, but famine occurred and people were overworked. In fear of his diminishing status, he instituted the Cultural Revolution that had the Red Army, China's youth, purge the four olds: culture, ideology, customs, and traditions. During this time, Ai Weiwei was living in a labor camp. His father, Ai Qing, was a poet who would tell stories to distract from terrible working conditions. He discouraged his kids from taking up art to avoid discrimination. When the Cultural Revolution was over, a family friend encouraged him to apply to the Beijing Film Academy, as all he wanted was freedom. So he went to New York for a while, but had to come back to care for his sick father in Beijing. His father left him with the duty to speak for those without a voice. So here we are today, with the sunflower seeds, the last of the 250 images. In the Tate Museum, there were 100 million of small, seemingly identical sunflower seeds that were actually each unique. There were a large amount of seeds that create a sense of vastness and visual uniformity, which is important, so keep that in mind. After the installation was over, the work was divided into smaller installations all over the world. So each of the seeds were handcrafted by 1,600 artisans from porcelain in the city of Jingzhen, which has a history of porcelain making since the Han Dynasty. Artisans claimed they were happy as it gave them a job when many were bankrupt. Each seed would take about 3 to 4 strokes, and Ai Weiwei argued that if you were a good artisan, you were able to do it in 3. But it's interesting that these non-industrially produced seeds are poured into Tate's industrial complex. Porcelain had been associated with China since its origins on the Silk Road, as the West associated China with its porcelain, even naming it China. Ai Weiwei uses traditional porcelain techniques to create his seeds. It involves a 30-step process where porcelain is made by heating white clay to 1200 degrees Celsius. They were made in groups where people would work together and different people would take on different procedures. So with these millions of seeds, it creates a sense of uniformity that I mentioned. Essentially, the individual seed is lost among the sea of seeds. It is a critique on China's ideals of conformity and censorship. His use of porcelain also comments on the history of the medium, as well as the negative Made in China label. Artisans created seeds that are different when inspected individually, which alludes to the porcelain tradition of the city of Jingzhen and uniformity and diffusion of cheap and what can be considered modern labor that China uses to play in the world economy. It asks the viewer to examine the lives of the foreign labor force that produce our many goods today. But why sunflower seeds? Well, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong in propaganda would depict himself as a sun and his followers as sunflowers, so his followers would look up to him for leadership and guidance. They were also seen as a bond of friendship, as they were eaten as a treat among friends during times of mass poverty. Another one of his pieces is called Human Flow. It's a documentary that focuses on refugees and their impact on humanity. Now for the old piece. Here's the funeral banner of Lady Di. It was made in the Han Dynasty China. It was made in 180 BCE and was made from painted silk. This one has a lot of tiny details, so pay attention closely. So Han China can be considered the golden age of China, for AP World's former classical period from 600 BCE to 600 CE. If you were rich enough, you could have furnished tombs filled with luxury goods. It was a tradition to have goods needed for the afterlife in your tomb. Remember the name Chu. During the Han Dynasty, Li Kang, also known as the Marquis of Lady Di, was given a fiefdom and had a wife named Lady Di and a son. They were a high family of the former state of Chu. Eventually, spoiler alert, they all died. Li Kang died in 186 BCE, and his wife and son died in 163 BCE. They were buried in 3 elite tombs that were found in Meiwangdi and give us insight on cosmological beliefs as well as funerary practices. Each of the tombs were painted with auspicious animals and symbols. Tomb 1 belonged to Lady Di, Tomb 2 belonged to her husband, and Tomb 3 was for her son. Tomb 2 was in the worst condition, but 1 was in the best. But today we're focusing mainly on Lady Di's tomb, specifically the funeral banner that was with it. Tomb 1 had 4 nesting coffins, with a 6-foot funeral banner in the innermost coffin. Some say it was a name banner to identify the dead in the mourning ceremonies or for burial shrouds to aid the soul to the afterlife. But almost anyone can agree that it shows a connection to the afterlife. It is important because it shows the first example of Chinese pictorial art and features the earliest known Chinese portrait. Okay, so if you haven't been taking any notes, start now. The banner can be divided into 5 registers, starting with the top is heaven, then the earth farewell scene, then earth life and afterlife boundary, then earth funeral feast, and last, at the bottom, is the underworld. Lady Di is seen in a silk robe with clouds standing on a pedestal surrounded by servants. It is her Hun soul that is leaving, and the Po part of her soul that stays. Above is a canopy supported by phoenixes and held by an owl. Above is the heaven scene. It is guarded by 2 guards with 2 felines. Above them, in the center, is the Curameng, the Queen Mother of the West. It is represented by a dragon with a human head. Surrounding are cranes that are seen partaking in the cup of immortality. The left side of the heaven scene is called the yin. It shows a crescent moon with a toad and jade. The moon goddess is seen at the bottom with the dragon. On the right, the yang shows the sun crow with the dragon and 10 suns. The yin and yang side has to do with the Chinese origin mythology story that involved each symbol. This is way too long for this video, but if you really want to see it, you can just read it yourself. Having the moon and the sun shows that it is a supernatural realm that is above the human world. Below the farewell scene is a border for the living and the afterlife. It is separated by a bee, which is a disc with a hole thought to represent the sky. 2 dragons on the sides intertwine in the bee. Underneath the border is the funeral feast of Lady Di. A tassel held by the bee is held as a covering for the feast. Food vessels is found in the foreground, and the midground has seated mourners. The funeral feast shows an interest and attempt at depiction with depth. If you look closely, a mound is seen, representing Lady Di, as a silk robe similar to the one found in the farewell scene is shown. The feast shows the 2 stages of Di's existence in the afterlife, the Jew and the She. The Jew is the body in its external home, where we saw Lady Di in the farewell scene. Its She is the corpse, where the family offers sacrificial foods for her afterlife. Below is the underworld. A Telemon holds up the earth. He is surrounded by dragon turtles and long fish with tomb guardians. It also has the tails of the dragons from the top. The red from the banner represents the color of immortality. Cinnabar, red ochre, powdered silver, indigo, India ink, and white from ground shells make up the colors. Her tomb shows a lot about Chinese culture, as it includes food, makeup, and instruments for the afterlife. Her coffin chamber was encased with charcoal and clay that was able to shut out air. Her tomb was so well preserved. Her body still has muscles and blood in her veins. It is so cool. I'm going to show you some of her body. Her body and veins were still there, and they were able to figure out her last meal was melons. Since her body was still intact, they did an autopsy that figured out her death was likely a cardiac arrest, as she was overweight. So now for tomb 3. Her son's tomb was quite interesting. It had similar items as well, but most interestingly was the amount of silk manuscripts ranged from maps to medical guides. They even had a medical guide about sexual intercourse and elixirs to improve performance. The obvious connection between these pieces is that they are both Chinese. They both have roots with the Han Dynasty, but the major connection is that they call upon tradition to critique China or to honor their ancestors.